Presumably you can see the slide here. First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to the AOM Strategic Management Division's Meet the Scholar program. So if you haven't attended one of these yet, you're in for a treat. These sessions are part of the division's Stronger Together initiative, which you can now see above my head here, the new background that Samina and company have kindly provided us. And it's one of many initiatives to increase opportunities for the community to get to know prominent members of the Strategic Management Division. And in doing so, building the community that perhaps we need now more than ever. When Katerina and I started chatting, we both agreed that we miss the community part of this, right? You don't see people like you do normally at conferences and things. So hopefully these are something to maybe fill that void a little bit. A big thanks to Katerina for helping with the technology part of this. She has done this several times and has pointed out my Zoom deficiencies, so I thank her for that.
It is not true.
So for those that don't know me, my name is John Joseph. I'm Associate Professor of Strategy here at the University of California, Irvine in Orange County, the land of COVIDiots. And I am an executive member. I'm a member of the executive committee of the STR division. Of course, a big thank you to Samina and the STR division for putting these together. It's a pleasure to be part of it, and of course, be part of this particular one because, of course, Mike Tushman, who you all know and know his work, I've followed since I was a PhD student. So it's very, very exciting to play this role here. Before we begin, just a few, first of all, the agenda, we're going to go about an hour with sort of guided questions that I have prepared. So we'll engage in a dialogue. After that, we'll open it up to general Q&A. If questions have occurred to you along the way, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. And once we get to that part of the program, I'll have you kind of read them off, or I can read them off when we get there. We ask that you stay on mute just until that part of the program, just so limit the background noise. I think this is going to be an exciting bit of time here. So first of all, I would like to welcome our distinguished scholar, Mike Tushman, for joining us today. So welcome to our Zoom session. So there is, here is somebody who is, let's see here, now I just have to move my slide here. Hang on 1 second, here we go. It's impossible to fit his vita on one slide, but let me talk about a few of the highlights. He is, of course, a Baker Foundation professor. He is the Paul Lawrence MBA class of 1942 professor of business administration, emeritus at the Harvard Business School. He's also the Charles B. Tex Thornton Chair of the Advanced Management Program, HBS. He was previously a professor at Columbia GSB from 76 to 98, and he received his PhD from MIT. The word distinguished scholar, I think, is apt in so many ways. He is officially a distinguished scholar. The Academy of Management Division's Technology and Innovation Management, 1999. He was named Distinguished Scholar by the OMC Division in 2003, and the ODC Division in 2016. He received the 2013 Career Achievement Award for Distinguished Scholarly Contributions to Management. He was elected Fellow of the Academy of Management in '96. He won the Sumantra Ghoshal Award for Rigor and Relevance in the Study of Management. That's absolutely true. Anybody knows Mike's work, that is, just an exemplar of both rigor and relevance in 2011. And he's a foundation scholar in the Knowledge and Innovation Group of SMS. His research, obviously, with 86,000 citations plus and growing, And by the way, 24 of those have 1,000 more or more citations each. He's got many, many journals and books that I won't go into detail on. But his research, as you know, is at the intersection of executive leadership, tech change, organizational adaptation, and importantly, his ideas have served as the foundation of a number of areas that we study, including information processing, congruence, fit, and ambidexterity, of course, among other areas.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's a little bit garbled. I don't know if your internet connectivity is a little bit fuzzy where you are.
Really? Okay. No, I'm not sure why that would be the case. I'm actually in my office, so.
Can you hear me just fine?
Yes.
All right.
Maybe it's the microphone then.
I'm not sure. If I sit closer, was this better?
Yes, it sounds like.
It did sound better when you were closer.
Okay, I can sit a little bit closer if that helps.
Yeah.
That's much better.
Okay,
Thank you.
so maybe it's a bad mic. It's a Lenovo laptop. Okay.
Okay.
Hopefully you captured most of that introduction. It's certainly on the slide. He's got a number of papers that have won awards. Academy Management's Best Paper Award with Mary Benner in August of 2004. A few others I have listed here. And lastly, and any of those that someone teach knows why he has as many teaching awards as he does, and he is a vanguard in executive education as well. So, welcome to our conversation, Mike Tushman.
Wow. Gee, John, thank you very much. That was like, wow. Thank you for all the attention to that introduction.
So let's start, Mike, by dialing back the clock, if we could, and find out, what attracted you to academia, and how did the road lead you to being a scholar and a teacher?
Yeah. So first of all, let me thank you, John, for helping organize this particular session, and Samina for organizing this whole thing with a range of really fantastic faculty, and for Katerina for getting us organized also. And to all the doctoral students here in this session, like, what a time to be a doctoral student. I don't think it gets any better given the sort of confluence of where our fields have been going and this pandemic we're living through. So I'll look forward to engaging with you in these 2 hours on whatever you want to talk about. So John, what was the first question again? What was the first question?
The road to academia.
Oh, the road, yeah. The road to academia was, pretty straightforward for me. I was a double E at Northeastern, and as many of you know, certainly Samita knows, Northeastern is like a magnificent university. By the way, it's gotten way better since I left. But the hallmark of Northeastern is the co-op program. And I spent, as a double E, I spent 5 years working for a company that was the very best test equipment company in the industry. And while I was there, studying to be an electrical engineer, the company proceeded to fail. And I was in a carpool. This is literally how I got into the field. I was in a carpool going back and forth from West Medford, Samina, to Concord, where General Radio was located. And these engineers who were the best in the test equipment business were all out of a job. And I thought at that time that if you were a great engineer, that was the way to prosperity and the future. And these guys were all out of jobs. So I essentially stopped being an electrical engineer to study this phenomenon. What the heck happened to this firm that was the best and promptly went out of business in the face of Hewlett-Packard, Tektronix, Keithley, and Fluke, who came into the industry with a completely different technology regime And essentially I left Northeastern, left the world of double E land to study organizations, technology, innovation, first at Cornell with a great group of faculty and peers. And then I went to MIT because MIT had, at that time, a really super program on technology management. So it was the scarring of my work, my co-op work. Had I not gone to Northeastern, had I not like lived through this failure, I would have been some like depressed engineer someplace now. But that experience has led me to academia, and I've been essentially studying that question, you know, for my whole career. You know, eventually, what I've often said is I've wanted to help my carpool friends understand what the heck happened. And at this stage in my career, I think I know what happened. And I think I can help. That's the beauty of our field, everybody, is the research we do as individually and a community can actually shape practice. And anyways, that's how I get into the field, John, is through the failure of this once great technology firm. And I've been sort of grappling with that, you know, for a whole bunch of years.
So you land in a PhD program, and maybe Mike, you could share a little bit about, you know, what surprised you about academic life at that point, or as even maybe as a junior scholar. What came? Were you prepared for what happened?
Well, my doctoral program at MIT, I was blessed by a great university. The Sloan School was and is great. I had a magnificent committee, and those of you who are doctoral students, I didn't really know at the time, in retrospect, anyways, I had a committee where Tom Allen was my chairman, and Ed Schein was on my committee, and Paul Lawrence. Paul was visiting MIT from Harvard. And Tom, when I was Tom and Ed, I learned basically hated each other. And I had to deal with their tension. And it turns out Tom was a certain kind of researcher with a certain kind of theoretical framework. Ed was a certain kind of researcher with a certain kind of framework. Paul was like amazingly, you know, was a collegial with both of them. And somehow I survived. That was my first surprise is, wow, major league tensions in our field. Oh, actually, even before that, I was at Cornell. I don't know if anyone from Cornell is in this session. I was at School of Industrial and Labor Relations. And as I left Northeastern, I went to ILR. And my first year there was a conference in honor of ILR's 25th or some anniversary. And in the room were Chick Perot, Jim Thompson, Chris Argyris, young Howard Aldrich, and young Marshall Myers, among others. And what I witnessed there, and I was like a master's student, was a real tension convention in our field. I said, oh my God, these guys are going after each other. By the way, there were no women in the room. There were no women faculty there at the time. That has changed for the better. But one of the surprises, John, was the number of fractures in our field and the disciplinary points of view and how people were in silos. And one of the things that I didn't like that. I said, hey, we're in a world, OB or organizational theory or strategy or innovation, wherever you are, it crosses those disciplines. So I was kind of surprised at that. I was surprised at the tensions in our field way back then. And where the real synergy comes, certainly in terms of my work, is crossing boundaries. And I've never really said this before. I think I've always worked hard to not categorize myself as an OB person or a strategy person or an innovation person, but I study a particular problem from different perspectives. So that was like a surprise, and the tension actually led to, for me, important creativity, dealing with those tensions.
You mentioned a few folks there, and I'm wondering, you mentioned Paul and Tom, obviously, and Ed, and others as you got into the field. I'm wondering who you might highlight as your early inspirations and folks that might have been instrumental in your early career.
Yeah. So sort of those faculty who really inspired me, well, partly was Tom Allen, my chairman, in his sort of rigor on studying things scientifically and getting really hard data. He was looking at sociometric data at the time on physical location and the propensity to communicate and the impact of that on performance in R&D. So he was a real like inspiring like scientist. I worked when I was at Cornell. Carl Weick was there, and I was like totally in awe of Carl. Now it was a totally different space, but his ability to think out of the box and think creatively, I would think he was in that of someone who's inspired me. Jim March. I mean, all my work has been inspired by Jim March and his like awesome creativity. And Paul, I guess, you know, early in my career, really shaped by Paul Lawrence, who was, who first taught me the importance of rigor, just like Tom, and relevance, just like Tom. We're kind of, Jim really didn't care about practice, and Carl totally didn't care about practice. Paul Lawrence and Tom Allen really did. And this notion of rigor, both empirically and theoretically, and having an impact on the world, those are the factors that come to mind right now as sort of early inspirations in my career.
So, and a few of those are you know, obviously have been colleagues and co-authors. Looking at your early vita in the first few papers, first of all, it's impressive that, you know, upon graduation or immediately after, you got an AMR, 2 AMRs, an AMJ, an ASQ right out of the bat. I'm wondering, you know, in those early papers for you, is there one in particular that you know, has special meaning, and if so, why?
My first sort of chunk of work based on my dissertation was on gatekeeping, boundary spanning. And I think perhaps my only sole authored paper was that ASQ piece on boundary spanning. I mean, that's near and dear to my heart, but I kind of, and all that my early work on information processing and social networks and performance in R&D, and then more generally in innovation. That got me tenure, and I'm like sort of super proud of that. I mean, I went from MIT to Columbia, and that social network work sort of was the foundation of my promotion at Columbia in New York City. I kind of was not in the growing Birdian world, and sort of the Ron Burt sense of social location and boundary spanning was really different than mine. I kind of then sort of left that because I was less interested in networks as such to this sort of general radio problem. How can this company, why did this company fail? And so my work with Elaine Romanelli and Elaine Romanelli on punctuated change and Phil Anderson on discontinuities and dominant designs, and then Mary Benner on the inverse relationship between process innovation, process intensity, and innovation. I mean, those are the works that really I think I'm most excited about, because it was it was fresh work at the time theoretically and fresh work empirically, and it cut across these boundaries that it was hard for people to code just what the heck is Phil Anderson, or who the heck is Mary Benner, and Elaine Romanelli and me. Is that we were studying a problem through different angles. So I think and the work that has been most cited is the work on technical change, punctuated change, competence enhancing, competence destroying, dominant designs. So that's the work that then got me off, and my future students with a whole range of stuff on evolution. Most recently, this piece that you mentioned, John, with Ryan Raffaele and Marianne Glynn on identity, basically identity dynamics in organization. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But the sociometric work was really important. But again, I wanted to be more than just R&D. I wanted to be more innovation focused, and that transition post tenure with amazingly great doctoral students. At some point, we should talk about the role of doctoral students for faculty, but I've had the amazing honor to work with some pretty outstanding doctoral students.
Yeah, so since you brought it up, I'll use this as a chance to talk about that, since that's obviously an important part, and you've had such great success with doctoral students. I happen to have emailed a few of them to solicit some thoughts. So what I'll do is I'll maybe just read a few, and then we could talk a little bit about your approach to working with doctoral students and things that you pass along. So. First, I have Adam Kleinbaum here. He was kind enough to write a whole lot, so I'm gonna shorten it a bit here. But he says he's talking about meeting with you. He routinely began our meetings, which usually took place at Pete's Coffee, where Mike shared Customer of the Month honors with his dog by saying, "Adam, you are such a good writer, but ... Mm-hmm. And he would proceed to tear apart whatever morsel of thought I had sent him before the meeting. He goes on to say, by the end of it, I felt like he had helped me make the work better in tangible ways. I felt he energized me to take the insights that emerged from our conversation and implement them. And third, I came away from those connections feeling like he had great confidence that I would be able to do it."
Wow, how wonderful.
Liz Altman, who we bonded over our interest and the history with Motorola, said, "Mike has helped me navigate the transition from industry to academia by modeling what a great scholar and business school professor should be, with patience and a firm hand when necessary. He inspired, encouraged, and led me to finish my dissertation and graduate." And then, of course, we have to mention Mary Benner, who also kindly provided a quote here. She said, "He cheered me on through the roadblocks in my dissertation. When I stumbled through questions I couldn't answer, he has continued to be my advisor ever since, his co-author and friend." Mike gave me some memorable advice. Mike said, "Do research that is provocative."
John, you're cutting out there. You're cutting out there, John.
Mike said, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
"Do research that is provocative. It should change how people think." He also said, "Be known for a question. Don't be known for a method or a data set." He has guided many scholars to finding interesting questions and rigorous answers. So a wonderful testament to you, Mike, that your students are so effusive and rightfully so. But maybe you could give us a little insight on choosing doctoral students.
Yeah, it has been sort of what's the right word? An anchor to my career is working with doctoral students. being in schools at Columbia and at HBS, and then I visited at INSEAD and a bit at Bocconi. These schools with doctoral programs, I know not all schools have doctoral programs, and I know doctoral programs in general are under attack. But man, I would not have done what I have done as a scholar had it not been for like amazing doctoral students. I always work with students who were interested in the topic of like, how come general radio failed? I mean, I've been hung up on that like from the get-go. And as long as they were interested in that general topic, and we hit it off, that was my criteria, that were their ability to really work hard, to have a theoretical bent and an empirical bent. And one of the recipes in working with doctoral students is, yeah, working on a problem rather than a methodology, being eclectic theoretically, and being willing to have heterogeneous committees. All the committees of the students you just read and all my other students, that we've worked to build heterogeneity into the committee, so they're kind of like wacky committees that represented different points of view. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, John, but those are the criteria I use to select students, the students who could help me push my research agenda, so that it was always related to technology, organizations, evolution. And, you know, for example, with Wendy Smith, more recently with Wendy and Adam here at HBS, I mean, I was not interested in paradox. I was interested in ambidexterity, structural ambidexterity. My work with Charles O'Reilly. Charles was not a student. Charles and I were colleagues from the get-go. He and I were students together. He was in California, I was in the East Coast. And we began to work together and eventually got onto this topic of structural ambidexterity. But I wasn't interested in paradox until Wendy said, hey, you know, what about these senior teams dealing with contradictory strategic agendas? And so I quickly moved with Wendy into that topic of paradox. With Adam, it was innovation across multiple boundaries. This happened to be at IBM, and he took a social network approach. So it was always with students who had some kind of interest in the general topic of evolution of firms and technology, and then building committees that were, so they left the program with an escape velocity that was rooted in a super question, really neat theory, and kind of bulletproof data and methods. That's sort of my recipe in working with students. And along the way, trying to write, you know, for example, with Mary, trying to write together a theoretical piece, our AMR piece, which was like a really magnificent piece. And then at least one empirical piece that spoke to a piece of the theory paper, of the AMR paper. That was also part of the recipe of both theory, empirics in multiple articles.
It sounds like that the part of when you're working with a student and putting together a committee is seeking the diversity, the heterogeneity. Of course, that is probably, on the other side of that is the tension convention you mentioned, right. And to, you know, since we have a lot of doctoral students on the, you know, participating, wondering what your advice is on that particular balance.
Yeah, my advice on that is, one is diversity is really important. And have a chair who has your back. The chair of your committee, whoever he or she may be, they need to know, they need to help you, but choose the committee in a way that's going to help you do a great dissertation and you're going to land with a fine job. And I think part of that is building in heterogeneity, is to help protect you from these various wars that are playing out in our field, so that you get the benefits of the tension, but you don't get swamped by it. So having a chair that kind of knows it and has your back.
Yes, and clearly you have done that for your students, based on my interactions with them and knowing.
Yeah, yeah. No, I've really tried that. I really, yeah, I did. I've tried that, John.
So maybe more generally, Mike, in terms of, your interests have revolved around a similar theme, but obviously different angles of it. How have you approached yourself and with your students, finding questions that interest you, finding, subjects to study? What sort of been, how does that process work for you? And, how did it change from your earlier days to kind of where you are now?
Yeah. So the questions have always been rooted in some innovation problem. Like early on, it was how come some R&D settings were differentially more effective than others, and then it went from the R&D lab to the firm. How come some firms make it through technological discontinuities, not others? And then that led into this notion of structural, basically Jim March's explore and exploit. Gee, how do you build organizations to explore and exploit? There's a basic organizational theory challenge there. Big debate in the field about, Kathy and I have had this long debate about evolution. Clay, Christian, and I had a long debate. So a lot of debate on that, how you both explore and exploit. But so that led to a bunch of questions, John. That then led to, hey, wait, if there is explore and exploit going on simultaneously, then Wendy's thing on paradox, gee, it has to start with the senior team and they have to grapple with paradox. And then most recently with Marianne Glynn and Ryan, we sort of fell into, I shouldn't say fell into it, but that then naturally led to this notion of identity, because identity, who we are and what we do, is the overarching frame within which structural ambidexterity can happen. So to me, it was one thing leading to another. And it wasn't lights went on one day and said, hey, let's study paradox, or let's study structural ambidexterity. It all led from one question, led to another, being pushed by doctoral students. Oh, and by the way, one of my if there's a recipe in my career, everybody, it was partly teaching well enough in the MBA program so the students didn't end up in the dean's office complaining about Mike Tushman. So I had to teach well enough in the MBA program. But my real passion was this doctoral course. I taught it for many, many years, an organizational theory course. Innovation, organizations, organizational theory, you call different things in different places. But I basically recruited all my doctoral students through this organizational theory innovation course. So working in the doctoral program was really important at Columbia, at INSEAD, and here at HBS. The other thing that I just want to get on the table, and maybe we'll talk about it later on, is really on in my career, I said, hey, what are important problems? And I discovered that through executive education, I would learn what important problems are. So really early in my career at Columbia, I recruited Charles O'Reilly and Jeff Pfeffer. And I pushed the administration at Columbia to let me start a program on leading innovation and change, something like that. And the answer was no. I really pushed it. Anyway, so that began a run that has been going on since maybe in that 1985. I mean, a long time. First it was me, Charles, and Jeff, and then Jeff peeled off and me. And to this day, Charles and I still do a course, Leading Change and Organizational Renewal, at Stanford and at Harvard. And the point of that is when like Laurie Rosenkopf was interested in boundary spanning in ecosystems. And when Laurie, and I would always introduce my doctoral students to these exec ed sessions. When Laurie goes in front of a group of executives and talks about these ecosystems and boundary spanning, and the participants say, hey, Laurie, that's important. I know that's important. Because the phenomena is saying it's important, not organizational theory types or not strategy types, not innovation types. But the phenomena is saying, hey, Laurie, that's important. When Mary said, when we cooked up this idea, there's an inverse relationship between process intensity, and at the time of her dissertation, there was the wave of Demingism. And we had that insight that Deming would be inversely associated with innovation. And we actually presented that to these executives, and they said, what a great idea. I'm feeling that. I said to Mary, that's a dissertation. Let's go there. So using and I don't want to be disrespectful for MBAs, but MBAs are clueless. In terms of the real phenomena, they just haven't a clue. They are going to be managers. When you're actually talking to managers, that's where I have, and my students have gotten insight. So I've really hyper leveraged executive education for me and my doctoral students in the idea generation phase. And frequently they would say, like, that idea is terrible. Don't go there. We wouldn't do it. But when you get feedback that, hey, when Marianne Glynn and Ryan and I talked about the stuff on identity, not personal identity, but organizational identity. And these executives went there. I said, hey, team, let's go there. Even though our work on identity flew in the face of the identity crowd, we don't have to go into that, but there is a whole identity crowd out there that we had to do some battle with. But hey, that's okay. I knew it was important because of executive education. That was a rambling thing, John, but it was part of this recipe of with doctoral students choosing problems and the problems shifting over time because the world shifts over time.
But you bring up a great point, and actually you answered the next question I was going to ask. Is sort of link, for junior folks, is it a good idea to bring your research into the classroom, vice versa? How do you do that? Because I think we all would like to, but it's not often easy to do for MBA audiences.
Wait, so say the question again. Using our research in the MBA classroom?
Yes, to the degree that that's possible.
Yeah. So here, I get a strong point of view on that. I have a strong point of view on a lot of things, John. I think our field, from Fritz Roethlisberger, Chester Barnard, back in the 30s or whatever it was, up to 2020, has an enormous amount to say to practicing managers and an enormous amount to say to MBAs. I think it's incumbent upon us to put it in a way that is perceived as useful and relevant. It's not research for research's sake, but research because it will inform decision-making, or it'll inform culture, or it'll inform, incentives. So I think we pay the rent by teaching and teaching well. Dave Nadler, who I should have mentioned earlier, Dave was at the University of Michigan, and he and I started at Columbia together. And we had to, again, pay the rent in the first year MBA course. And we developed this congruence model, which has been probably among my most impactful pieces of writing. It's a way to look at how and why organizations work the way they do. And it was a way for us to integrate the literature on processes and design, capabilities and culture, and strategy and senior teams in a language and in a framework that had an impact in the classroom. So that it's incumbent upon us to teach well enough. And if you have some passion, you teach excellently, but you gotta teach something. And in our field, it can't be a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Except which you have this organizing framework, which I have had over the years with this framework that Dave Nather and I, and then Charles and I adapted it over time, Charles O'Reilly. That has been really fundamental to my teaching and to earning credit in the MBA classroom. And then that got me out of MBA land into doing an elective in MBA land, partly with Mary Tripsis when she was at HBS, and then to executive education. And this congruence model, it was really the beginning of ambidexterity, because structural ambidexterity is multiple alignments simultaneously, senior teams and paradox. So that congruence thing was a way both to integrate the research, and it helped me get better ideas on evolution. I'm not sure I answered the question, John, but
No.
there's something about teaching in there.
Absolutely. So, maybe broadening the lens a little bit, what excites you today in the field of strategy? What kinds of things are you working on that you're bringing into the classroom, your executives?
Yeah. So I think this last paper you mentioned, again, one thing leads to another. This piece with Ryan Raffaele and Marianne Glynn on identity. And basically, what I want to say to my strategy colleagues is strategy is important. But even more fundamental than strategy, I believe, is this: who are you and what you do, the identity of the firm. And that's sort of separate from execution. But I'm really super interested now in this notion of passion, this notion of identity, and the role of leaders in shaping the identities of their firms, and this overarching frame within which paradox can exist. It's a narrative. If you aspire to be the world's greatest container corporation, then you have the ability to do all kinds of different forms of containment. So I'm super interested in bringing back passion. This is way back, by the way, to Chester Barnard. This is not the first time people have been talking about passion. Chester Barnard, Phil Selznick on infusing the organization with value. That's like a super old idea. We just want to bring it back to our strategy colleagues. I think strategy too often is passionless. And that's important, but it's important to embed these analytics in something that people can sign up for and be emotionally engaged in. So that's one thing. The second stream that I'm working on, John, I spend a lot of time with current students on, is the impact of sort of openness. In a world where everything can be modular and the cost of communication and computation is zero, then the locus of innovation, which for most of my career was in the firm, now moves to the community. That was Liz Altman's work. And my recent students' work is how do you manage and how do you deal with ecosystems where the firm is a player in a larger ecosystem, and the role of openness and distributed innovation on the firm. And finally, this is not what I'm working on, but those of you who are students now, this issue of sort of COVID and what COVID means to firms. I think it makes the work on strategy and innovation and organizational learning more important. But I'm just not sure that all the assumptions and the theoretical machinery we built beforehand are right for a post-COVID world. I just don't know. But I think there's something around punctuation, and there's something around distributed technology, and there's something around learning that in this COVID world, we got to get our hands around. So if I was a current student, you cannot not work on this issue of how COVID is affecting organizations. But that takes place more broadly in a world where the locus of innovation is now no longer firm-centric, it's now community-centric, and the notion of leadership in that world and the locus and the notion of decision-making in that world, I think is quite different.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. Obviously, this is affecting all of us in unexpected ways. And I think, certainly it's affecting many industries. Higher education is one of them. The Harvard Business School case study model.
Right.
And I'm struggling with this now. So this is a question I'm really anxious to hear you answer. Case studies are hard to do on Zoom, quite frankly. I'm wondering, how do we deal and how do we approach what has become the bedrock of business school education,
Yep.
i.e., the Harvard case study method in
Right.
a COVID Zoom world?
Yeah. So universities in general, at HBS in particular, are built around physicality. We demand that our students and our executives come to campus, and we build campuses around face-to-face interaction. This COVID thing, where legally I cannot go to campus. This is an existential threat to every university on the planet. So we got to figure this out. This is one of these punctuated chains. This is one exogenous shock that we all have to deal with. I actually think, so I'm sort of, so that's the point. We all need to shift our strategies to a different customer base, a different client base, a different technology of teaching, and sort of get over it. Get over the fact that we used to teach face-to-face, now we don't, we teach through Zoom. I actually think that, so I teach in the Harvard Business Analytics program. For whatever reason, Kareem Lakhani and several other faculty from around the university started this program like 3 or 4 years ago, and it was built, John, it was built where it would be fully online, and students would come to campus for one weekend. That's it. So we built a fully online program. And when Kareem asked me to join, I said, hey, this cannot possibly be any good. Well, I've come to learn, so there are 3 things in education. One is content delivery. The second is community. 1, can you deliver content well? 2, can you build a community? And when they're on campus, you build a community. And the third is certification. Do you get a degree or do you get a certificate? Well, I've learned through HBAP that I can deliver the case method in an engaging way online. It's not 100%, but it's maybe 80% as good, John, than being directly in your face, moving right in your face. But it's not it was not as bad as I thought it was. So I've been, I can deliver content asynchronously. So our ability to deliver content asynchronously and then synchronously through me engaging through Zoom works pretty well. And if I was Nithin Noria, the dean of the Harvard Business School, I'd be saying to myself, this is better, or not better, it's almost as good, it's faster, and it's way less expensive. I'd be super worried about the MBA program because that is vastly expensive. And we ask people to come to campus, and this HBAT model is pretty damn good on delivering content. Okay, but the community is going to suck because no one's ever together. Well, it turns out through Slack and through sort of social media, and one weekend, twice over 9 months, this community is pretty awesome. So I'm now pretty bullish about our ability to deliver online stuff to students who've not been on campus before. Let me say it differently. For the brand new, I run the advanced management program, senior executives. If they were mid-flight, and if they're in module 2 and we're working together and they have to go home and they can't come back, they're going to hate a Zoom classroom because they know the on-campus stuff, John. But if I start fresh, like we're doing next month, and we deliver AMP solely online, this may be better. It's actually maybe a better program. So I would ask those of you who are actually teaching to like get into it. And I guess it's not 100% as good, John, but my experience has been it's pretty good on both the community angle and the content angle. And by the way, we certify them also.
Well, that's good to hear. Because I think we're all facing this coming year thinking, oh boy, here we go.
And here's the difference, John. One last thing, and I'll let you finish the question. What I do to make my classes more engaging is I give them study questions in advance in the Harvard Business Analytics program, HBAT. And the students are shocked that I actually read their responses. And I know who they are. And when someone has blown off the questions, like in class, I like nail them. When someone's at home, like nodding away, I say, hey, son, you're sleeping. Luke, like, hey, Luke, wake up. So, and I would say, hey, Jay Mills, that was a really lame response to that question. And once they know that I know who they are and I'm engaged with them, the level of like interaction and the level of engagement sort of skyrockets.
Yeah, that's a good tip because it's easy to get disengaged when you're just seeing names, right? So I think this is a question which is a little not related to the other ones, but I know Samina likes this question a lot, so I want to make sure that I get it in. And that is, what are you reading these days? A favorite author, favorite books? Yeah. What on your casual time when you're not consuming scholarship? What?
Yeah. Some of you may know Tiziana Casharo. Tiziana is an amazing scholar at Toronto. She was a dear friend of mine. And when she learned that I was going to be emeritus, move to emeritus Baker Foundation thing, she sent me War and Peace. So I have just finished War and Peace. Compliments of Tiziana. So that's like a magnificent thing. I've always wanted to read it. And so I knew either Samina or you would ask that question. That is my Tiziana Cacharo War and Peace story. And it's in fact true.
So light reading.
I must say it's a tome, and I got the physical, by the way, I got the physical, she sent me a physical book. But like every page was amazing.
That's that impressive. Well, that's great. Well, Mike, first of all, let's. We're gonna switch gears here. To open this up now for others to ask questions of you.
Right.
I think before we do that, Samina would like to take a picture of the gallery here.
Now, what I would love is if you feel comfortable, folks, and you're dressed well from the waist up, if you could show your video, that shows a lot better than just showing a bunch of names. So maybe I'll give everyone a minute to kind of show their video if you feel comfortable. I think it always is a little bit more personal that way. And then I'll take the picture in a few seconds. All right, this is great. A lot of people are coming on. I know everyone's listening. You don't want to miss Mike Tushman's wise words. So, all right. So if everyone could look at their screen, and I'll count to 3, and then I'll take the picture. All right. So 1, 2, 3, cheese. All right. I think I got a great one. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Samina. Okay, so we're going to use the chat for questions. If you would enter your question into chat, I can read it, or you're welcome to raise your hand and unmute, and you're welcome to ask the question of Mike yourself. Our first one, Olga, would you like to ask Mike your question on data collection?
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So yeah, my question is indeed about data collection, but it's also more about building connections with business and decision makers in organizations, because we often use confidential data, proprietary data from organizations. And in my personal experience, it's very difficult to convince organizations to share those kind of data with us. So what is your approach? How to build these connections? How to find these organizations who might be willing to share this data? How to convince them? And sometimes I also face with this situation that the more organization is willing to share their data, the more messy is this data. So they basically have nothing to hide because no one can figure out what they have. And good quality data is very difficult to get because companies are afraid of confidentiality issues.
Right, right. So I've got 2 answers to that, Olga. The most primary answer is you should have a chair. Olga, are you a doctoral student?
Yes, I'm a third-year doctoral student.
Yeah, all of you as doctoral students need to have a chair who can help you get access to firms. And again, I have always used exec education at INSEAD, at Columbia, now at HBS. I've strategically leveraged my exec ed work both on problem formulation, as I mentioned earlier, and on getting access to data. Because these executives, because they know me and they trust me, I introduced doctoral students in the beginning of the program. I think Liz Altman may be here, I saw her name. I have all my doctoral students, like Hila met the NASA, she did her dissertation at NASA because she met Jeff Davis in one of my executive programs. The Adam Kleinbaum project at IBM became real because a bunch of IBM executives knew me and then were interested in social networks and performance. And Adam got like an amazing data set from IBM. I think your chair needs to have some access to firms where they trust him or her. And the more, Olga, they can be engaged in your topic, the more excited, the more they can co-create with you, both the research design and getting high quality data. And again, with Adam, we actually had one of the senior vice presidents of IBM design the research with me and Adam, and Toby Stewart, by the way, was on the committee, and then help get the data from IBM. That's the first point. If you knock on a firm's door and have this academic question, they're going to like shut the door in your face because they're not interested in academia. They're interested in their problems. So the more you can collaborate with your chair, the better. The other is in my earlier studies with Elaine Romanelli and Phil Anderson and Mary Benner, much of the data came from public sources. We did these industry studies of various industries, and that came from public sources. So there was not an issue on getting access from firms. So that's one answer to it, Olga. Either you rely on public sources or you have access to firms because they trust you through your chair.
Okay, our next question. Anne, would you like to ask this of Mike?
No, you can just ask it for me.
Okay.
Hey, Anne.
That's okay. Hi, Mike.
Hello.
Yeah, you can read the question. It's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Absolutely. It says, Mike, thanks for sharing. I have a question on behalf of doctoral students. It's a great time for addressing many important problems of our world, but students are worried that journals still like papers on traditional topics, strong theories, strong methods. Important problems may be ill-defined and no theory seems to fit. What's your advice on having them have the courage to study problems they actually care about? Many want to have an impact on practice, but are not sure that the journals and the tenure committees care about that.
Yeah, boy, that's like a really big deal question, Anne. I've had an ongoing debate with our journals about fresh and different theories and methods. I think my career has been filled with battles with the editors of our various journals. And somehow I've survived. But there is a conservatism in our journals that is Tom Kuhn circa 2020. I mean, the structure of scientific revolutions was not only important back then, it's important now. So I think that is really the case. I think that if you have the courage and the passion to work on some problem of practice, but on the other hand, I still believe that theory is important. And I don't believe it's sociological theory or theory from psych or theory from economics, but it's theory that comes together, cross-boundary theory about some phenomena. And I still think it's important to get your theoretical ideas out there and test it empirically, and do battles with the journal system. I'm not sure that's a good answer, but where universities still have this world where you get promoted by your reputation in the field, and the reputation in the field is from where you've published, I do think that's a real issue. And I do, by the way, feel that the field is fair. So when people send their articles, when their work is sent out for peers, senior people to review, people do a pretty good job on that. And if it's not placed in a first-tier journal, but appears in a second or third-tier journal, and it's a breakout piece, I think faculty recognize that. But I still think that Ann's general point is well taken. If you're really interested in practice and have a more practitioner-oriented point of view, then you're probably not going to make it, through the journal system. And should we talk about that? That's my first reaction to your question.
I don't know if it's appropriate in this setting. There might be some other questions, but I love to push it a couple steps further. I'm not saying theory is not important. Is that okay, John?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
We'll
I'm not
get to
saying
the
that
other
theory is not important. It's absolutely important. That's the only way we understand the problem and hopefully find so-called solutions, but possible and understanding and answers to the problem. So that's absolutely no debate about that. But I think the fundamental problem is structural and socialization. I feel as students just really feel they're very powerless, but actually they are not, because, and young scholars too, because journals can only publish what they get. And if we start sending in papers, all important problem, well done, I really believe journals welcome that. So there's some level of misconception about what journals like, and that conservatism is there. That's in the hands of the reviewers. But I'm just trying to see if you can help kind of think about how do we empower the doctoral students to believe they actually have lots of power.
Yeah. Oh,
to
that's
change
a great
the field.
Yeah. That's a great point. And I actually think that that basic insight that doctoral students have more power than they think they have is exactly right. Faculty need you almost more than you need them. So you need to know that. That might sound pretty weird, but I have needed my students as much as they needed me. That's point one. But in terms of the journals, let me give you an example. Hila Lifshitz was a student of mine a while ago. She did some work at NASA. And she discovered something at NASA, which seemed like the traditional not invented here, where these scientists at NASA rejected open or distributed innovation. Out of like 100 heliophysicists, 90 rejected it, and it's the same old, not invented here. But she found that 10 loved it. And we said, wow, this is something here about identity, organizational identity, professional identity, and boundary preparation. And I can't tell you, Ann, how beaten up she was in the review process. But, she kept at it. And she eventually won over the reviewers because the beauty of her data, it was ethnographic. It was like bulletproof, the data. You couldn't poke holes in the data. And she had a really wacky kind of theory that wasn't just this and it wasn't just that. It was cooked up for this particular phenomena. And I think that if Hila were here, I'm not sure she's here in this session, she would say, oh my God, that was pretty brutal. But at the end of the day, this article won the best, article from a dissertation last year or 2 years ago at the Academy. So I think that courage, and she was pretty stubborn. One was stubborn, two had courage, and I personally support her because I knew she had something really unique, and I knew the reviewers were like way off. They were super conservative.
I remember there's a phrase, good research is not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah, right.
So they have good stuff, good ideas, persistence in strong methods and important problems.
Yeah.
You win over the field.
Yeah, very well
That's
said.
the courage I'm talking about.
Yeah, very well said.
Thank you,
I
Mike.
completely agree with that.
Thank you, Ann. Yeah, I think I'm pronouncing it. Aline, we got into the research practice link question. We got into that subject a little bit. You're welcome to ask and ask your question if we didn't quite cover what you were you were asking in the chat box. Is Aline there?
You're on mute.
She might be on mute.
Yeah.
Yes, you are on mute. Yes, you are on mute. Aline Elias?
Yeah, I tried to unmute. Thank you, John and Samina. It's our pleasure to meeting Dr. Tushman. Yeah, I think Anne already covered like a lot of that concern of mine. It's more about like joining the literature conversation while at the same time being useful to organizations and theory at the same time. Like coming from a practical background. Yeah.
And so what's the question, Aileen?
How can we appeal to both like journals and at the same time be practical?
Yeah, well, I think those are two completely different papers, Aileen. What I meant by to me, you get problems that are important by talking to the phenomena. And then you do research, like this thing with Hila, you know, this research that is important theoretically, empirically, and the field wants to know more about professional organizational identity and preparation and so forth. But the extent to which Hila wants to have an impact on practice, she's going to have to write a Sloan Management Review article or a California Management Review article or an HBR article. It's a completely different outlet for her practical stuff. But I know it could hit, should you want to do that, because the basic insight came from Jeff Davis, who was the head of life sciences at NASA, saying, oh, wait a minute, I completely missed this identity thing. And so that led to her, this like path-breaking research. And should you want to do an HBR, Sloan, California management, she could do that too. But I think it's really completely separate audiences, and the writing, like my writing with Charles, our books that he and I have done, most recently Lead and Disrupt, that is explicitly meant to be useful to practitioners and not be laughed away by our professional colleagues. I mean, we want this book to be both professionally respected, like it's not a joke, and readable to executives. Oh yeah, wow, I should have thought of that. I can use that. But it's a very different kind of writing than our AMR-ish writing or ASQ writing. So those are different writing projects.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question, Hui Sun, would you like to ask your identity question or your identity battle question?
Yes, so thanks a lot for sharing. It's been really grateful for us to have this opportunity to hear the great advice. So I actually have a question about how you fight the battle with existing identity community, because I mean, there are a lot of topics in our field that have a long legacy, and the long legacy tend to have a lot of branches, and it's hard to convince everybody. So I wonder if you have like, if you don't mind sharing some of your strategies in convincing this audience about it. Important and valuable, but I mean, your approaches may differ from the existing frameworks.
Yeah, you mean on these professional, you know, how different members of our profession see a particular topic? Hui-sun, is that the question?
Yeah, because I mean, you mentioned that it's hard to please these existing communities.
Yeah.
So I wonder like how you introduce a new idea that.
Yeah. So let me just stick with an example. This paper with Ryan Raffaele and Marianne Clidd, we first sent it to AMR, and it got the traditional identity crowd, and we got completely clobbered. And we tried to respond to their comments, but they coded us as attacking the world of identity. and it was rejected. And this is, we mentioned earlier, like, I was pissed. I've written a bunch of fine papers, and this is among my best. And these 3 reviewers, like, totally, you know, we couldn't crack it. We tried really hard after several rounds of review. We said, hey, all right, we're not going to make it through the identity door. And we went to SMJ, and we framed it for the editor as it's strategy, identity, and change, something like that. And we really made it clear in our letter to the editor, I think it was Connie, that we've been through this identity thing in AMR. It's not going to work. Send it to strategy people, because we really want to impact the strategy crowd. We want to impact the technology crowd. We want to impact the innovation crowd. I basically wrote off the identity crowd, and we got great reviews. The SMJ reviews made the paper way better. So I mean, anyway, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but there are these battles out there, and you need to know that they're there and be aware of it. And sometimes you get an opening, like Gila got an opening, but we did not. But in the paper with Ryan and Marianne, we didn't.
Thank you. So the next question, Joshua Ekblad, would you like to jump in here?
Yes, thank you, John, so much for pronouncing my name correctly. Thanks for that. And also for providing this very valuable forum. It's really amazing set of talks that you guys are doing and that I'm enjoying. Let me just read what I wrote in the message board. Hi, would love to have your thoughts on how your more recent work on organizational identity relates to earlier work on structural ambidexterity. Specifically, the former seems to rely on a more top-down view of firms, such as leadership, sponsorship, whereas the latter seems more to highlight bottom-up agency in independent organizational subunits. So I think of champions in that context. So I would appreciate your take on my assumptions. And I'm thinking about this in the context of corporate venturing units, which to me operate very much like these sort of ambidextrous structures, and the extent to which there's a lot of agency that goes on inside of these units, and in a way they operate in a very entrepreneurial manner. And I'm a former startup guy myself, so I've always viewed your work in that light, and I've always seen it as a very agency-driven, very bottom-up kind of championing the individual with these large, complex organizations with various logics. So I'd just like to understand how the identity work, is this a different?
No, yeah, I get the question, Joshua. Great question. Structural ambidexterity does indeed build in agency. If you think about variation, selection, and retention, or more recently, this ideation, incubation, and scaling, that the ideation or the variation is very much a decentralized, autonomous, random variation kind of thing. The problem is, Joshua, that they get, when you try to go to scale inside a GE or some incumbent firm, Schlumberger or whatever, when you try to take the variation and go to scale, I even think incubation is easy. I think that ideation and incubation is trivial. And you get all this autonomous behavior. But going to scale is like really difficult. Most of the variation gets killed by the exploit unit. So the extent to which you have an exploit unit with all the power and all the resources, you got all this variation on the explore, almost always the exploit kills the explorer. The reason I fell into paradox and then more recently, identity, is because that identity can provide a logic whereby the exploit can actually collaborate with the explorer to go to scale. So it's an agency at a higher level. Basically, it's a social movement kind of agency, where at the senior team level, you're building this more encompassing, more abstract identity. Or we're in the work with Ryan and Marianne, we're broadening the cognitive frame so that the exploit person can say, hey, wait a minute, I kind of get why we're doing the explore. And if the incentive, if they have common fate incentives, we're going to have both going on simultaneously. So the reason I got to senior teams and then paradox and now identity is because the exploit, in a very much a population ecology world, the explorers got killed unless there is a senior team that can hold attention. And one way to hold attention and hold the paradox is, oh yeah, we're here to do great containment, or we're here to keep plants healthy. Or at NASA, what literally Gila fell into was those 10% of the scientists, Joshua, who embraced open innovation, said, we're here at NASA not to do great heliophysics research. We're here to keep astronauts safe in space. And that little coding thing, that's what I do. I keep astronauts safe in space. That permitted them to do great heliophysics research and open innovation at the same time. So that's a kind of long-winded answer to, yeah, there's a lot of agency down here, but without overarching identity in a senior team that can handle paradox, this variation gets selected out.
Thank you. It's very interesting. And just one last follow-up question. What's the mechanism that you have in mind for that? Is it that somehow it mitigates self-censorship, or is it some direct action coming from the top management team?
The mechanism is that when you have a senior team that embraces paradox because they understand it in their heads as we're here to keep astronauts safe in space, that the heliophysics researchers code open innovation not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The coding of that thing switches from a threat to, hey, wow, this is going to help me do my job better. And if you can help that coding, and to me, the not invented here syndrome that has been around in our field forever is around coding mismatches, if you will, is where you code thing as a threat and therefore kill it, as opposed to an opportunity to live into this aspiration of, you know, at HBS it's training leaders who make a difference in the world. And when it's that abstract, you can do it, John, through you know, the web, and you can do it through face-to-face education. I think that's the mechanism, Joshua, is in the senior team. And by the way, when there's a common fate incentive, hey, now I kind of see, that's why we're investing in this exploratory stuff.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Next question, Andrea Wessendorf, would you like to ask your question about multiple theoretical perspectives?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you again for organizing this and for taking your time to share your experience with us. My question is, because you're drawing or you're studying problems from various theoretical perspectives, which I think is very rich and yeah, sheds different lights onto a phenomenon. But I wonder, looking at the same phenomenon from very different perspectives, in the publication process, you usually tend to draw on two different theories or two different perspectives. Did you ever think that that was a constraint, or did you usually think that helped you focus? How did you deal with that?
Well, really from the get-go, Andrea, actually, once I moved away from my early sociometric work and the information processing work, there was a literature and I was squarely in that literature. Once I moved to this punctuated change, dominant design, and by dexterity thing, that's when I had to bring in multiple literatures.
Mm-hmm.
But what helped me with the reviewers was we're interested in a particular dependent variable. Like the early work with Elaine was these firms died and those firms didn't. And taking a strategy, innovation, OMT literatures to explain that dependent variable. So I've always found when you have a dependent variable or you have some phenomena that reviewers find of interest, and this is back to Anne's notion earlier, the extent to which you can pull together an interesting provocative theory that crosses boundaries, that's great. But the dependent variable, the phenomena has to be something that people care about. If it's just another slice of population ecology, like nobody cares, except the people who are in population ecology. But if it's some dependent variable that, you know, OT person or strategy or innovation person, yeah, go, figure it out. That's what helped me and my students deal with the review process.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, we have a question that was submitted before. This is related to your, I think, comment right now about DVs. Is what do you see as the main questions in the innovation literature at the moment? What DVs maybe should we be thinking about? And a related, maybe I'll just throw this out since it's kind of related, is, you know, folks who are interested particularly in platform organizations and ecosystems and, and whether that's part of the answer.
Yeah, is Liz Albin here? Liz, are you here? I saw you.
Hi, Mike.
I say, hey, Liz. We should all congratulate Liz. She just got married, so congratulations again, Liz. And she's actually on this session.
Thank you.
So I learned about platform. So this whole notion of platform organizations and platforms and innovation and openness, I mean, that is a like gigantic space that strategy scholars, OMT scholars, innovation scholars ought to go to. They're dealing with platforms as opposed to the firm. I basically think the Chandlerian firm that many of us grew up with, the basic Chandlerian firm is toast and it's like going away fast. It's not that it's totally gone, but this sort of platform ecosystem world, and I'm not sure there's a dependent variable there, but that's the theoretical machinery I'd like to work with. And I really learned that through Liz Altman. Other dependent variables, I just don't know, John. I just because I'm focused now on this issue of passion and identity, I'm sort of like zoned into that. So I don't have a good handle on what other important dependent variables would be. But I would encourage you, this is back to either Adam or Mary mentioned that in their note, is to find something that you can be identified with, either some dependent variable or some mediating variable that can say that, hey, yeah, that is you. And in fact, Liz and I are working on a paper now with another colleague that we're going to try to capture this label. So whether it's a dependent variable or mediating variable, it's some kind of theoretical framework that people can identify you with, and it can spawn a bunch of papers, a bunch of empirical papers.
So Liz, good to see you, by the way. You know, your co-authors have come up many times, and this is kind of a question related to something that was submitted, but how do you, or maybe a better way to phrase it is, how would you recommend that junior scholars choose co-authors, collaborators, you know, senior versus junior, someone who studies what you do versus someone who provides compliments? Could you maybe provide some advice to folks in that area, since we're always struggling with that one?
Yeah, that's a great one. as I think back on my career, my co-authors have either been students who I've worked with early in their career, and then they go off, or friends. So I did a bunch of work with Ralph Cates, good friend of mine, Charles O'Reilly, dear friend of mine. So it's either people who I love to work with, or students who I love to work with. And I think it's really that hey, do you have the, and my collaboration with students is all based on, can we think and do creative stuff together? It's just sort of this sharing, it's having co-authors who you can share and brainstorm with, and there's no impediment to that, whether they be students or whether they be just plain old friends. I think that's the way I've chosen them, John. But again, yeah. Anyways, that would be my answer.
Thank you. Samina, I think you had indicated that you had a question for Mike.
I have a serious question, then I have some fun questions. So a serious question, Mike, something I like to know is, when you were growing up and in your childhood, was there someone that was pivotal or an event that was pivotal in your life?
Yeah. Yeah, so there was in terms of my academic career, I grew up with an extended family in the Boston area. And one of my uncles, Morris Cohen, was a very famous professor at MIT. And like, he had these various titles, and he eventually became an institute professor at MIT. And those of you who know MIT, it doesn't get any more statureful than being an institute professor. In fact, he became an institute professor. The year he became an institute professor, he was a material scientist, by the way. Morris Cohen and Paul Samuelson became institute professors at the same time. I said, wow, this guy's my uncle. So he had like a huge impact on me as an academic. And when I was in high school debating where to go to college, my parents took me to Morris Cohen, major league professor, and he looked at my grades and said, wow, like something like, this is nothing to write home about, or something like, oh my God, this is a little bit embarrassing. What are you going to do? And that really, from him at that moment, that led to like pretty amazing shift. And that was a pivotal moment in my career. It was my uncle, and always admiring his professorialism, and then getting that pretty direct feedback that, hey, you're pretty mediocre.
Yeah, sometimes we need someone else to knock us back to reality, right?
Yeah, and perhaps more than our parents. Partly that's the role of parents, but in this case, it was my uncle.
I'm convinced my kids listen to anyone else other than me and my husband. So maybe that's what it took. So actually, before I ask my other question, John, I think Anne and Kate both have a question as well.
Okay, Kate, yeah, you had two comments about the identity issue. Kate Walker? Is Kate still with us?
I see Kate. Oh, Kate, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, we can hear you. You want to ask your question?
Yes, it's the definition of identity that you use seems to be identity research. Very focused.
Hey, I can't hear you, Kate.
I don't know. It seems to be the definition of identity is identity research. What is identity research that you? There are many ways you can define identity. Many ways. And it seems to me that you are talking about identity research. Maybe Samina can translate that.
So Anne, Kate, I'm sorry, are you asking what does he mean by identity research? Is that right?
Yes, yes. Because it seems to me that the whole conversation was about identity research.
So Mike, I think her question is, what did you mean by identity research here?
Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah, here's my answer to that, Kate, and I'm happy to discuss this with you. I think the identity is the answer to who are you and what do you do as a firm. So if I want to get at identity and I'm talking to a general manager or a division general manager or CEO, the question I will ask that person is, at the end of the day, what is your firm? Who are you and what do you do? And I'll simply listen to what they say, Kate. And that I will code as the identity of that firm. And basically the paper with Ryan and Marianne asks leaders to separate who you are from what you do. And if you put it together, that's a recipe for failure. But when you separate what you do, which is to be strategy, from who you are, which is more abstract, that permits you to do this variation, selection, retention stuff that we talked about earlier. So that's what I think about as firm level identity, Kate.
Kate, does that answer your question? Okay, I didn't quite hear her, but I'm going to assume that's a yes.
My question was answered, and it's very interesting because it's about there are many ways you can, as I said before, you can define identity. But this one, it's you have been talking about identity research, and I was not quite sure what you meant by it. So it's identity of the firm, and it's very useful. That you actually clarify that you have to separate who you are and what you do.
Right.
Because then it's going to define your research design completely in a different way.
Right. Yeah, and that's the whole point of that paper with Ryan and Marianne Glynn, is to separate them out, keep them empirically and conceptually distinct, and then Ryan is now working on actually empirically doing that.
Great. Thank you, Kate. So I'll, given the time, Anne gives me permission here, I'll read her question about social innovation. Mike, she asked, what about social innovation? Do we know a lot about it? It seems to me that this is an area that can contribute to both theory and solve societal problems like poverty, inequality, justice, climate, etc.
Yeah, that's super great. And I think in this day and age, this social innovation probably could not be more important. I think of Julie Badalana's work on dual organizations. And these are organizations that do well and do good. So they're not for profit. They're organizations that, on the one hand, do have a profit dimension, and they have a doing well dimension simultaneously. So I think whether it's work on not-for-profits or whether it's this dual hybrid organization work, I think our field, it's incumbent upon us as a field to do more on that social innovation space. For example, let me just give you one example. And again, I have the opportunity of being, I am a senior professor and I've been around for a long time, but because I was sufficiently interested in what I think about as social innovation, I sort of inserted myself into the Graduate School of Education here at Harvard. So I now teach a doctoral course in that world, and I'm doing some research on public education. And I'm not sure that would be social innovation, Anne, but it's taking the work in our field on innovation, strategy, and change and bringing it to the space of public education, which desperately needs innovation, strategy, and change. I think that is particularly, I'm not sure I would coach untenured faculty to do that because I'm both teaching in the ed school and the business school, but just in terms of a pure research play, I think my go-to person on that is Julie Badalana, and she's had a magnificent career in that space of social innovation.
Thank you. I just don't see enough in the management literature. So I was wanting you to say a few words about that to encourage our young colleague to. That's a really important space to go into.
Absolutely. And what we can contribute from the business school space to social innovation and public sector innovation is like, couldn't be more important these days.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Again, if you have any questions, please enter them in the box. I think Samina had some some additional fun questions, Mike, for you.
I have so many questions for Mike. Mike, a serious question first is, I'm sure you've been asked often to write letters for people. And so along with doctoral students, we have a lot of junior faculty on the call. So what advice would you give to assistant professors as they're working through their tenure clock and writing their research statements and identities for the field to get to know them and to decide on tenure?
So what was the question again, Samina?
What advice would you give to assistant professors as they're approaching their tenure clock and getting ready to present their portfolio of work to letter writers?
Yeah. Well, I think two things. One is through, and again, I'm not sure what the implications of COVID is for the academy, but people need to know you. People in your research community, or what I've been pitching out, multiple communities, need to know you and code your work as, hey, this is really unique and quirky and different and solid. So they need to be able to code you as a first-class scholar. The other advice, and maybe if you're 3 or 4 or 5 years into the mission, it may be ex post, but I always look when I'm writing letters, is there a research stream here? Does this add up? Is it a series of 8 papers that are all different and therefore less than, I mean, it's hard, you're hard pressed to create a narrative about person X who has 8 papers that are all fine, but they're in 8 different areas. This person has no identity. This is a person who knows how to do research and can do the crank and produce something. I would much rather see, 8 papers on 2 topics or 8 papers on 1 topic. And you're really building out a research. And let's just take, Anne's notion of social innovation. I mean, the reason that Julie Badalana was able to get so many fantastic letters is because she had like a whole bunch of papers that were all around this notion of hybridity and duality. And she had a bunch of colleagues, and she was able to be part of a community on social innovation. And however number of papers it was, I don't remember the number of papers, but it had a much bigger impact than a bunch of singles, if you will. So I would again, start with a big, important dependent variable or a big, important phenomena and a big, important sort of theory, AMR-ish kind of thing, and then build a set of empirical pieces around that.
Right.
And get involved in the academy. Like, this is a really, what Samina and John and the board members in the strategy group, and then is so important to get involved in the academy.
I like how you brought it back to really research identity, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of what I heard.
Yeah. Right.
And I'm hoping through actually these are all of our Stronger Together initiatives. This is, you know, addressing some of Anne's questions. We're socially innovating, even how we're all connecting, and as AOM as an organization, how we function. So Mike, I have a few fun questions that I've asked everyone for who I've been able to participate. So we want to know, what is your favorite dessert?
My favorite dessert? My favorite dessert would be the one I had yesterday, a chocolate chip ice cream.
Chocolate chip ice cream. Okay. And I'm sure you have.
Empirically, I had that yesterday, so I know that's I have some data on that.
Is there a recency effect here? Okay.
Maybe.
I'm sure you've traveled the world. What is your favorite city?
Oh, that's easy. That's like a no-brainer. My favorite city is Paris.
Paris. Okay.
Go back to Paris in a heartbeat. My wonderful wife. When I visited INSEAD many times, and we lived in Paris and commuted to Fontainebleau, and she did her first book on the markets of Paris, so we kind of know Paris pretty well.
Beautiful place.
Yeah.
You mentioned when John asked the question of what you were reading, and you mentioned Tolstoy. What I think all of us want to know, we know you're so prolific, you're so busy, you give to so many doctoral students. What do you do in your free time, or how do you unplug?
Yeah, so we have, my wife and I have 3 grandchildren, so I'm not sure unplugging is the right word, but we have 3 grandkids, and they were just with us for the past week, so I'm not sure I would call that unplugged, Samina, but we were with our 3 grandkids this past week. But beyond that, we've really gotten into the physicality of gardening. I mean, where my academic stuff is very head stuff, abstractness and writing and being in my office, being in the garden is very sort of anchoring in like totally the real world. So that's a newfound passion of mine is gardening, taking care of our garden and working the garden.
And it's with some real tangible benefits, I hope, if you can keep the bunny rabbits and deer out.
Yeah, totally. And the vegetables from that garden.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Something meditative. That's great.
Totally.
Well, thank you. You know, Mike, we've taken so much of your time. I want to thank you on behalf of the division for giving us your time. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone that we learn a lot. I learn every time I hear from you. So thank you so much. We have, you know, a lot in common, Mike and I. We both started out as electrical engineers, and I remember you congratulating me when I moved to Northeastern, and that meant so much to me. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to John to close out our session.
Great. Thank you for making this happen, Samina.
Thank you, Samina. So Mike, I give you the last word here. Is there, you know, do you have any words, for lack of a better way of saying it, hope or positivity for our group of scholars here online in this time of difficulty? Anything you kind of, you know?
Yeah, I guess I think that in this sort of pandemic infused world, the stuff we do could not be more important. The research we do in strategy, innovation, leadership, change, I mean, it could not be more important. And the extent to which we are out teaching in business schools, whether it be MBAs or whether it be executives, they are at the proverbial coalface and dealing with an unprecedented crisis. And this, in terms of our ability to have an impact, it doesn't get any better. And just in terms of research opportunities, this is, you know, every 100 years or so, there's some kind of exogenous shock. Well, here's an exogenous shock that affects the strategy of every single firm, not just in an industry or a country, but around the world. And so as a research opportunity, it probably doesn't get any better. And again, that also overlaps with the stuff that Liz was talking about earlier on platforms, is that we're now living in a post-Chandlerian world where the nature of innovation and strategy is now shifting. And because of that, leadership is shifting. So it's a great time to be a doctoral student and a great time to be a young professor at a professional school, because boy, the world needs us more than ever.
Thank you. Message of impact and opportunity. It's a nice way to end. Want to say thank you very much to Mike Tushman for just a thoroughly enjoyable 2 hours. So Mike, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. I really had a blast, guys.
Also, a thanks to Samina and the STR division for organizing these. We've had a few. We have a few more. I don't know if there's one before, but I know there's one on Friday with Ed Zajac because I'm moderating that one. So, but the calendar is available on the website, right?
Yes.
And
people can still, weekday.
And people can still sign up for those. So please do. Thanks to everyone for Zooming in today. Please all stay safe and healthy, and hopefully we'll see each other in person soon.
Great. Very good, everybody.